So welcome everyone to the Week 11 podcast as we continue our journey through pre-modern Indian narrative literature. Now this week we're continuing our focus on bhakti by reading through a story that often gets overlooked when thinking about Indian classical literature, but which is really important for the bhakti movement. And I'm talking here about the story of Hariścandra, the noble king who lost everything at the hands of an angry Brahmin. We'll also be looking at our only female poet of the semester, actually, Janābāī, who was a Dalit bhakti poet who composed her poetry in Maharashtra, the western Indian state of Maharashtra, sometime in the late 1200s or maybe early 1300s. The Hariścandra story is an extraordinary story, and Janābāī is an extraordinary subaltern voice who captures some of the deeper social aspects and issues around the bhakti movement, at least as articulated in this western Indian state of Maharashtra around the year 1300 CE. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about the story and about how Janābāī is telling it as we talk about it in class this week. But to kind of get us started, in this podcast, I'd like to first go over some key ideas about how bhakti was practiced in Maharashtra in this 1300, around that time, through a movement called the Varkari movement, and especially how pilgrimage and performance culture kind of played a key role in the Varkari lifestyle. We'll also talk about Janābāī and her place within the Varkari movement. And then in the rest of the podcast, we'll go through the rather harrowing plot of the Hariścandra legend as it's told by Janābāī, so that maybe we can start thinking about how that story is a kind of inversion in some ways of the Rama story. The plot is pretty similar, actually, but rather than a sort of story of conquering and victory, conquest, right? Our king Hariścandra, it's all he does is persevere to hold on to an inner truth and kind of hope for the best through tragedy after tragedy that happens to him. So let's take a look at Janābāī first, and this bhakti movement that grew up in Maharashtra about 800 years ago in the late 1200s or the early 1300s. The Varkari devotional tradition is a very distinctive aspect of actually Maharashtrian regional identity. Even today, there are millions and millions of devotees who engage in the kind of Varkari sampradaya all over the state. Now, the primary deity for the Varkaris is a manifestation of Vishnu called Vitthal. Or sometimes he's also called Panduranga Vithoba, and his temple is located in the small town of Pandharpur in southern Maharashtra. Vithal's name means standing on a brick, a vit, literally, and that's actually part of his the legend of his origins. So the way the story goes, Vishnu once decided to visit one of his loyal devotees who lived in Pandharpur named Pundarika. But when Vishnu came to pay a visit, Pundarika was actually too busy in the house having to take care of his parents, his elderly parents, and so he didn't even bother to see who was at the door. He just kind of threw a brick outside and said, "Hey, just wait on the brick until I'm finished with my work." And so as the story goes, Vishnu did just that, and eventually he remained standing on the brick forever, along with his wife also, Rakumai. And so when you visit the Vitthal temple at Pandharpur, you can still see them both there, standing on bricks with their arms kind of on their hips, waiting for Pundarika. Now, going to see Vitthal at Pandharpur is in fact the kind of central part of being a Varkari devotee. Every year, more than 800,000 pilgrims walk from all over the state for miles and miles to Pandharpur. This annual pilgrimage is known as the Wari. And that's actually how the movement got its name. A Varkari is any person who does the Wari pilgrimage. It's kind of like in Islam, right? If a Haji is someone who's done the Hajj to Mecca, right? The pilgrimage to Mecca. Vitthal, as a deity, was originally has its roots as being worshipped as a pastoral god by shepherds in the sort of Maharashtrian countryside since at least the 500s. The temple at Pandharpur was founded around the beginning of the second millennium, 1100 AD. The tradition of devotion to Vitthal kind of has grown since that time, and especially as like sort of moored to the Pandharpur as a place, and it's provided an important way in which horizontal networks of religious and cultural connections get formed in the state of Maharashtra. So Maharashtra becomes a region through these kind of networks of devotees. There are basically three key features of the Varkari movement that we can think about. One, the tradition involves an idea of itinerant pilgrimage to Pandharpur. And also to actually other places, the birthplaces of the various saint poets who make up the movement. Secondly, it involves singing and a storytelling performance tradition called Kirtan, which is performed in the vernacular language of Marathi. So it gives it a kind of regional flavor. And third, this movement involves a multi-caste community of devotees. The idea is that they all eat together, walk together, dress the same way, they sing together, so that the boundaries between the different high and low castes get erased, at least temporarily, while they're in this pilgrimage. So let's look at the second feature of Varkari Bhakti a bit more carefully, this idea of kirtan performance. This is also a site where poetry and literature have continued to remain alive within the movement. The word kirtan itself means to sing praise, and it's a form of bhakti that's found across most Indian vernacular traditions. Basically, you have kirtans all over India, basically all the way from the south to Punjab. Basically, kirtans are live performances of the medieval bhakti poetry of the poet saints, the sants. They've been continuously performed since the time of the sants, so for more than 800 years, we could say. A Marathi Varkari Kirtan is structured kind of like as follows. There's a main Kirtan performer who's known as a Kirtankar, who's accompanied by one or two drummers, usually playing a pakhawaj, as well as a kind of raucous chorus that stands behind the main singer. They play cymbals and do these little dances and sing along to the music. The Kirtankar selects a poem, an abhang, as it's known, from one of the great Marathi saints, and sings and gives a sermon about its meaning. Typical Kirtan performances these days go for about 90 minutes or 2 hours. In the past, Kirtans regularly went on all night long. Everyone usually sits together in the audience, regardless of what caste you belong to. And all the devotees typically wear a simple, plain outfit, all white, a white tunic, a white dhoti, loincloth, a white hat. Women usually wear a simple 9-yard sari that's usually red or saffron in color. Kirtans have created in this way a certain, what we can call bhakti publics, communities that are bonded together through such shared cultural markers and experiences. And we can maybe think about this idea of a public a bit more as well, because it's a really good example of how storytelling, poetic performance, religious participation creates communities, and these communities, not just in India, not just for bhakti devotees or even within religion, but really for all human societies, how performance creates communities. For one, these kirtan singers are itinerant. So they're going from town to town, village to village, singing similar kirtans in every place, and earning a modest living doing so. These performances, of course, have been going on for hundreds of years in Maharashtra, all across the state, in the language of Marathi, meaning that this bhakti poetry and the stories that are told in all of these live settings create a strong networks of regional cultural connections and also identities based on those networks all across the areas in which these kirtan singers are traveling. Also, these kirtan singers have provided Maharashtra with a certain sense of cultural history, right? They've kept this poetry of the Marathi Sant poets alive in the public consciousness of people who attend these events, so that the saints, these sants, continue to serve as ideal models for the public for how to live a good life, how to be a good person, how to be a good devotee, how to be a good member of the Varkari community, and in doing so, how to transcend the barriers of caste, of gender, of poverty, and other deprivations that we might encounter. Taken together, we can think of kirtan performances as creating horizontal connections between groups of people who are taking part in listening to a kirtan. And again, I'd like to say that happens in every group, in any group all over the world, right? Think about even our class. We've kind of started to bond together, I think, because of all of those Friday performances that we've been doing, right? As we all take part in sharing interesting narratives, talking through interesting topics, we begin to share meaningful cultural connections with each other that form a sense of group identity. In a word, stories, poems, songs, these things create love between the people who share them. So let's maybe take a look at who the central poet saints were in the Varkari community, who the community kind of traces their origins to. And this community, of course, has grown to be millions and millions. But back in the late 1200s and early 1300s, the movement was a bit smaller and involved a couple of key figures, the key sants, Namdev and Jnandev. Right? Namdev, his traditional dates are 1270 to 1350. He's said to have been from a low caste background. His family is a family of tailors. He leaves the profession in some ways to travel all over the region as an itinerant singer of Marathi bhakti poetry. He was for Varkaris the kind of model kirtankar, the original, right? And even now, kirtan singers, they structure their own performances on their belief in what his original performance would have been like. Namdev roamed all around Maharashtra, but also all around North India as well. And this mobility connected Namdev to North Indian bhakti traditions as well that were taking place in Braj and Awadhi and so on. He's thought to have influenced Kabir. There's this kind of legend that he meets Kabir and hangs out together, even though the time wouldn't work. The chronology is kind of screwed up for that. Many of Namdev's poems are also have found their way into the compilation of the Guru Granth Sahib, the sacred scriptures of the Sikh tradition. So he's a kind of inter-regional celebrity in that sense. One reason why Namdev maybe appealed to North Indian bhakti is because most of his poetry can be seems to fall into a kind of nirgun idiom. There aren't a lot of stories that he tells about Ram or Krishna or whoever. Instead, what we get in his poems is an intense devotional focus on the idea of God's name, the Naam of Vitthal. Let's take a look at one of his poems, The Whole of This Life. The whole of this life I will sublimate into happiness, although it has become formidable with sorrow. The name of Vithoba I sing fervently, for his name fills my heart with happiness. The cravings of my senses are fully satiated, all the passions in my heart subside. My ears hear only the verses of your name. I do not hear praise and censure of the sinful. Seeing your pure face, adorned with earrings, my eyes cool down. I will hold your feet along with the brick so that my body will be contented. In the company of saints I shall dance round and round. So that my threefold torture will vanish, Nama says you're the kinsman of an entire happiness. I will never forget you, O my munificent God, even for a moment. You can see that this poem is playing with nirgun ideas and some sagun stuff as well. Now, around the same time as Namdev, there was another saint poet named Jnaneshwar, or Jnandev, who's traditionally thought to have lived only for 21 years, from 1275 to 1296. He died young. Unlike Namdev, Jnandev came from a high caste background. He was a Brahmin. His family had been excommunicated. Their property was seized. So that basically they were kicked out of their village into the streets with nothing. He and his brothers were initiated into the Nath tradition of Tantric yoga. And Jnandev was also deeply kind of versed in Indian philosophy. His greatest contribution was to translate the Bhagavad Gita, the central text of classical temple bhakti, if you remember, into Marathi and give a Marathi commentary. This is known as the Jnaneshwari, and it's thought to have been a crucial piece in kind of creating a public interface for Brahmins to be able to engage with these mostly non-Brahmin bhakti traditions of the Varkaris. So Namdev and Jnandev kind of are two sides of the same coin in some ways. They're regarded as having been friends. There's an idea that they traveled together and they worked together to preach the faith across the countryside. We don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story anyway. The two saint poets come to be regarded, no matter what, as the kind of centerpieces of a multi-caste community of devotees to Vitthal, the Varkaris. And the idea is that they imitate these two, and they go on pilgrimage annually to Pandharpur. They perform kirtans, they celebrate and keep alive the memories of these two saints, and also of many other saints who hail from all the different parts of Maharashtra and from different castes and social backgrounds. One of these Marathi Sant poets is Janābāī. She was also contemporaneous with Namdev and Jnandev. The story of Jani is that she was a Dalit orphan. She was raised by Namdev's parents. Remember, they were also low-caste tailors, right? She worked as their domestic servant, so she was the servant of low-caste family and helped to raise Namdev, even though she was probably kind of his same age, maybe not much older than him. Once Namdev became a poet saint, Janābāī also became one of his most dedicated and ardent followers, so much so that in her own poetic stamp, her chop, she calls herself Namyachi Jani, right? Janābāī, who belongs to little Namdev, Namya. Though she was Namdev's maid and his devotee, she was an active poet in her own right and composed many different bhakti poems. She also produced two longer forms that are called Akhyan Kavyas, or narrative poems, and this Hariścandra story is one of them. Janābāī's poetry brings a much-needed women's perspective, I think, into our conversation of bhakti, especially because it concentrates on how service, humility, and truth can be mobilized to rescue yourself from the most adverse conditions, especially if you are powerless within the society. So if you're a Dalit, if you're a woman, you can still use truth to your advantage. The typical miraculous situation that Janābāī is associated with is that she has to press oil using a stone mill, which is sort of back-breaking hard work. But she sings poems to Vitthal as she does so, Vishnu, and Vishnu comes invisibly and helps her turn her stone mill, which makes her work easier. Other people can't see Vitthal, and they are laughing at how silly she is for singing songs of love and devotion to this absent God. But for her, her faith helps her keep him there and helps her get through her tribulations. Madhuri Deshmukh points out that Janābāī finds the divine inside the home, inside the domestic space, rather than in the public space. And this is what differentiates her from other female bhakti poets. Deshmukh says that domestic interiority rather than exuberant exteriority is what Janābāī is seeking. This idea, I think, kind of does also emerge through the story we're going to be looking at this week, which is Janābāī's version of a very famous story known as the legend of Hariścandra. Hariścandrākhyān in Marathi. The word Akhyān means legend. Hariścandra's Akhyān. Let's turn to that now and kind of walk through the story. So, like I said, the legend of Hariścandra is an often overlooked but a very important story in Hindu religious culture. It involves an old ancestor of Ram, the Ikshwaku king named Hariścandra. He's a noble and generous and truthful king, but still he ends up having to sell himself and his wife into slavery in Benares, all because he owes this debt to an angry and sort of kind of mean-spirited Brahmin named Vishwamitra. There's a couple of Sanskrit versions of the story, but it really starts to take off in popularity in the vernacular cultures of the second millennium, and we find versions produced in nearly every vernacular language. It was alive in the oral tradition, and each region kind of has its own variations on the plot of the story. Now, at its core, the story of Hariścandra is a story about truth, satya, and how this abstract concept can be mobilized to be a weapon of the weak, so to speak, as a way to overcome terrible abjection, hardships, poverty, deprivation, low caste status. Right? We're going to be reading Janābāī's version of the story, which was written, in Marathi in maybe the early 1300s. Her master, right, her guru Namdev, also had written his own version of this story around the same time, and there's actually key differences between them that kind of help us to see how her voice is a feminine one. There is some doubt, I suppose, whether her version is authentic. Maybe there's an idea that maybe it's a fake that was written by a man much later, centuries later in the 1500s. This is kind of what Madhuri Deshmukh says and leans towards. You can choose to believe whatever you want to believe, of course, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about, whether she was actually a woman or really a man writing as a woman. Anyway, let's go through and see how Janābāī's version goes in brief, and then we can kind of hash out how it might be different than other versions of the story. Like all good stories, the Hariścandra story begins with an outer frame. The divine sage Narada comes up to heaven and praises how great King Hariścandra is, the Lord of Ayodhya. He's the most noble and he's the most good king of earth. The sage Vasishtha, he's Hariścandra's guru, so he kind of humble brags about how great his student is. But then his rival, his arch rival, the Brahmin sage Vishwamitra, he gets angry at this. He makes a bet that he can get the king to stop being such a good person. He can make the king lose his sattva, his goodness. So the bet is on, and Vasishtha hurries down to earth before Vishwamitra begins to warn the king that Vishwamitra is coming down. He's going to test his goodness, and no matter what, he should not leave the palace. He shouldn't go to the Brahmin's ashram, his hermitage, under any circumstances. Then we see that Vishwamitra performs a tantric ritual sacrifice to the goddess. He magically creates a tiger that starts to attack farmers and cows and pilgrims in the kingdom. The public comes to the king and begs him for help. And so even though he knows that there's a danger of leaving the palace, he knows about Vishwamitra, he still goes out into the forest to kind of get rid of the tiger. Vishwamitra then creates a golden deer to lure him into his hermitage. He goes there. Hariścandra rests for a bit at a pond. Vishwamitra then sends 2 servant girls to go and seduce Hariścandra, the king. But the king rejects their flirtatious advances. He's kind of mean to them. Vishwamitra then accuses Hariścandra of being arrogant, mistreating the women. Vishwamitra also himself beats the women for failing to seduce the king. There's mistreatment of women all through. Hariścandra then gets sleepy and falls asleep in the ashram. Vishwamitra appears in the king's dream. The king offers him in the dream his whole kingdom as a gift. And then he sees this frightening giant person with an iron club, death with an iron club, and then suddenly wakes up. Vishwamitra then comes in his waking state and asks the king for a money gift. He asks him for some gold. The king says, sure, but let me just go back to Ayodhya, to the treasuries, and get it for you. So they all go back to the city, but when they reach the palace gates, Vishwamitra stands at the gate and starts to beat Hariścandra's wife, Taramati, violently with a stick. He says, look, you've already given me your kingdom, so this is already mine. How do you dare you go into my palace uninvited and give me my own gold? Go find your own gold and pay me your debt. Right? He gives him a month to do it or something like that. So Hariścandra then decides to travel to the holy city of Varanasi with his wife Taramati and his son Rohidas. And the idea is that they're going to sell themselves into servitude in order to repay the debt because they now own nothing. Right? We get then a set of episodes that describe what happened to the trio on the road to Benares. This plotline is unique to the Marathi versions of the story. Most other regional versions skip this whole thing and go right to the events of in Benares. In Marathi, the versions, though, we see a whole series of, again, tortures that the Brahmin puts our trio through. First thing he does is he creates a forest fire so that Taramati is separated from her husband and son in the smoke. She freaks out, and then she freaks out even more when Vishwamitra comes there and shows her two corpses that he says to her are her husband and her son. So she's in total grief. She feels like the only thing she can do is kill herself, so she starts preparing a fire to throw herself into. And so finally, Vishwamitra, right before she's about to kill herself, ends the illusion. So he says, look, it's all an illusion, it's all a trick. And he reunites her with her husband and son, and they move on. As they're walking along, Vishwamitra comes in the disguise of an old Brahmin, and he asks the trio for their shoes so that he can wear them. Each of them nobly gives one by one to their shoes to him obediently, even though it's like scorching hot, and so they're walking barefoot in the scorching heat of the road. Vishwamitra then creates a fake oasis, a kind of rest area, filled like a pond filled with all kinds of nice fruit and like all kinds of attractive women and so on are there. And each of them one by one, he rushes up and tries to tempt them to stay at the oasis, right? Forget about their trip to Benares or whatever. He even creates fake versions of the other family members, Hariścandra, Taramati, and their son, to trick them even more into thinking that the rest of their family is already also staying there. But each of them, right, for different reasons, remains true to the mission and declines the offer. They stay true, right? There's satya that they maintain, and they continue along the road to Varanasi, even though they could have given it all up. Once they reach the holy city, then all kinds of horrors begin. Hariścandra puts up his wife and son for sale. Vishwamitra, again in disguise, comes and buys them to work as domestic servants in his Brahmin home. But the money that he gives isn't enough to repay the debt, and so Hariścandra has to sell himself into slavery as well. Then out of the crowd, a Dalit, a member of the Domb community, comes and buys the king, and he puts him to work in the cremation grounds. Vishwamitra keeps harassing the king even now. I mean, the debt has been repaid, but still he keeps harassing him. Hariścandra's job is to carry water to the Domb's house. But every day Vishwamitra comes and starts throwing stones and breaking the clay pots, shattering them, and the water, goes out. Every day when Hariścandra gets his food, he goes and sits to eat it for his dinner. Vishwamitra comes in disguise and asks him for a bit of, food, and until he keeps eating basically all of Hariścandra's meals. So Hariścandra is starving, and he sucks at his job, so the dome puts him to work at the lowest job of all, which is to guard the cemetery and to charge people to have funerals there. Vishwamitra keeps harassing the wife, Taramati, as well, in the same way back home, kind of abusing her verbally. Eventually, he disguises himself as a snake and bites the son, Rohidas, who dies from the snake bite. Taramati then goes and finds her son's corpse in the middle of the night. It's all really horrible, these scenes. Vishwamitra then tricks her again. He says, hey, go take the corpse and hide in the temple. There's a witch on the loose, right, in the middle of the cremation grounds. Then she falls asleep in exhaustion in the temple with the boy. He tears the boy's stomach apart, takes his intestines, his entrails out, and rubs them all over her face. Then he runs out of the temple and starts screaming, hey, hey, there's a witch inside the temple. Everybody comes out. The dome comes and arrests her, the master of the cremation grounds. And then he orders Hariścandra to execute her. Hariścandra recognizes that this is his own wife, but he still prepares his axe to chop off her head, to do as he's told, to follow his orders. But then, just as he's swinging his axe down onto his wife's own head, Vishwamitra comes running, grabs Hariścandra's arm in mid-swing, and explains that it had all been a test, and he offers Taramati a wish. She says, may I have a son like Rohidas, a husband like Hariścandra, and a man like Vishwamitra to demand things of her in her next life. At this, Vishwamitra admits his defeat. He gives up his bet. He gives Hariścandra all of his religious merit that he's earned through his various austerities and rituals. The gods then come down in their sky chariots and invite Hariścandra and his wife to come directly to heaven, join them. But Vishwamitra says, no, I need to give him back what's rightfully his on earth. First, and he needs to rule his people, so he reinstalls Hariścandra as the king, and the story comes to its conclusion. We should say, though, that in most versions, Rohidas is also brought back to life. In Janābāī's, it seems like the boy stays dead. There actually aren't too many real miracles in the story, only some magic tricks and illusions that create more and more adversity and hardship for Hariścandra and his wife. The real miracle is the miracle of truth in some ways, and so maybe we can talk about that more in class. So see you then.